Good morning. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. Last week we took a look at the initial stages of the new act, the Trust and Real Estate Services Act, and we looked specifically at the things that had already been done, and that was phase one, and then we doubled down on discipline. I want to do an overview of some of the things this act is bringing in, and we're in the initial stages. I haven't really been able to read the act, so forgive me if it's a little bit sketchy, but I hope it'll give you a little bit of an idea of what's coming. We talked about phase one. Phase one was the introduction of PREC, personal real estate corporations, and the use of different terms to designate yourself as a real estate agent or as a realtor. Phase two, the first thing that's happening is they're revising the Code of Ethics. Now, when I say revising the Code of Ethics, right now, under the Code of Ethics, there's technical and procedural issues. Those are going to be removed from the Code of Ethics and put on under the general heading. And so the Code of Ethics are going to be strictly talking about integrity, quality of service, and conflict of interest. And it's going to be dumbed down to plain English instead of something where you got to read 3 times to make sure you've got the meaning of it right. So watch for that, the Code of Ethics. The second thing I want you to be aware of is something called an information guide. Those of you who have been involved in rental real estate, you remember that some years ago, the government rolled out a templated lease that all landlords were supposed to use in the province of Ontario for residential leases, and it was about 15 or 16 pages, and half of it was rights and obligations at the back. Well, this is like that. This is rights and obligations within the new act, and it is very much spelled out, and it has to be presented to the people you're working with before you get involved in providing service for them. Information guide. I haven't seen it. It isn't drawn up yet, but let me tell you a little bit about it. One of the things it's supposed to do is it's supposed to explain the benefits of client relationship as opposed to a non-client relationship with the realtor. It's talking about some of your working options, some of the options you have in working with a real estate agent. It's talking about the duties, and this is interesting. When it's talking about the duties, when we get down to, for example, dealing with a seller, the duties are going to specifically, if you're going to do staging, for example, or if you're going to do a 360 video, you're going to spell that right out in this information guide. If you're going to do an open house every other weekend, you're going to spell that out. You're going to spell out specifically the services you provided. Similarly, if you're working with a buyer, how often you're going to show them property, how are you going to acquire the properties you're going to show them, what type of properties you're going to show them, and so on. It's going to be very explicit in what you're going to be providing for them. And then it gets into remuneration options when you're dealing with the listing. And this is interesting. You're going to spell out the amount that you offer to a cooperating brokerage. Now, we do that now in the listing agreement, but sometimes we just kind of bury it in there and they sign it. No, you're going to sit down with the seller. You're going to explain to them the options. If you're taking a listing at 5% and you're offering 2, you're going to explain why you want to offer 2 and not 3 or 2.5, and you're going to have to get their express consent for you to do that. You're also going to have to talk about how and if it can be subject to change. Often when you take a listing, you'll say, you know, if I sell it myself, I'll drop it by 1%. That needs to go in that information guide. The terms for termination. Often we'll get a call, not often, but from time to time we'll get a call, and somebody wants to either break a buyer representation agreement or a listing agreement. In this information guide, it will spell out how and if the agreement can be terminated. And it will require their initial on the expiry date, even if it's only a week. Right now it's 6 months or more. They have to expressly consent to it. Now it'll be on all of them. Then it'll go on to multiple representation, and it will deal with multiple representation, and it will require their express consent to participate in dual agency and multiple representation. And it will also involve material fact. Now, material fact is a gray area. It's difficult because what's a material fact to one person is not to another necessarily. For example, somebody dying in a property. One, depending on their ethnic background, they wouldn't touch a property like that. Another one wouldn't think twice about whether it happened or not. It doesn't matter. So you got to find out by asking a lot of questions, what are material facts? When you take a listing, you got to find out what the seller perceives as material facts that will affect the value of the property and identify those. When you're dealing with a buyer, you got to find out what their material fact orientation is and document those and get it acknowledged. And so that's all part of this information guide. Then there's something, a change, and I want you to get this, from customer. Customer is no longer an option under the Trust and Real Estate Services Act. It's now a self-represented party. Self-represented party. That's a little bit strange, but they want to make it clear because I think they're finally getting, they didn't understand. They felt that the only way you were an agent is if they signed a buyer representation agreement. But the common law of agency says if you advise or if they rely, then you have implied agency. And they recognize that now. And so they're saying, we want to make sure that it isn't something called a customer. They're self-represented. They're not represented by you. And we've got to go through this information guide with them and make sure they are clear on what benefits are available for agency and what benefits they lose if they're self-represented. And we look at the restrictions, and it spells out the restrictions. You cannot provide opinions, you cannot provide advice, you cannot provide services, but you can assist, and that's where it gets gray. You can assist. And so the self-represented party, you go through the information guide, and then you present them with a party acknowledgement form, a self-representation party acknowledgement form. And they acknowledge what services they're not getting, and they expressly consent to it. In there, you explain the limitations, you explain the type of assistance you can provide, you strongly urge them to get independent legal advice, and then you request them to sign. Or you can bring a horse to water, you can't make a drink, you can't force them to sign, but you encourage them to sign. And if they don't sign, you mark and that they refuse to sign, but it was presented to them, keep it in your file. So, we've got to be very, very careful. Now, let me talk for a minute about this assistant. It's a little bit gray, and I may have to come back and revise because I haven't read the documentation at this point. But here's my understanding. I can show them property if they're self-represented, but only limited. I can show them my listings because I'm assisting my client in getting this property sold. I can assist them in drafting up an agreement of purchase and sale, but only if they're buying my listing because I'm assisting my client in putting a deal together. Otherwise, basically, they're on their own. Gone are the days where I say, well, you're not a client, you're a customer, hop in the car and let's go look at property. That's changed now under the self-represented party. So be very, very careful about that. And then the next thing is something, and this is being worked on, and it's called a designated representative. One of the problems with agency is, and under the common law of agency, it says that the brokerage is the agent. And the common law of agency assumes that anybody who works for the brokerage knows what everybody else knows. And if we were a soybean company and we were selling soybeans, we knew the moisture content and the price per bushel, everybody would know that. We'd have common information. If we had so many thousands of bushels available, we'd know that. But in real estate, it doesn't work that way. So what they're trying to do now, basically what they're trying to do is change agent from the company or the brokerage to the individual. And that would be a designated representative. The broker would still be responsible to oversee the whole operation, but the individual agent would be the individual person would be the agent. So if Derek Abrams had an offer on Zoe Otis' listing, Derek would be only responsible for looking after the best interest of his buyer, and Zoe would be interested and responsible for looking after the best interest of her seller. It would be exactly the same as if a LePage agent was selling a Megara listing. So that's where they're moving toward. And the way I see it would work, I don't think one person one time could be called a designated representative. The next time they'd be called an agent under a common agency. I think a brokerage will have to decide whether they're going to go under designated representation or leave it the way it is under the common law of agency. And so I think that's something we're going to have to work out. They're fine-tuning it. It isn't finalized, but they're looking at that. And a couple of jurisdictions across the country have already got it. And I think you're going to find it's coming. The last thing is open offers. Right now, the Act states that you can't divulge any information about an offer. And that will change under open offers, and it's at the choice of the seller. If the seller so chooses, everything or just the price or the details or the terms of any offer can be communicated to everybody else who's submitting an offer. And it becomes more like an auction. So what happens is a number of offers come in, and the salesperson presents them to the seller. The seller looks them over and says, this is the highest one. Go back to everybody else and say, we got $872,000 on the table. Are they willing to increase beyond that? And throw it back to everybody. And the only thing you won't be able to do is identify who the parties are involved in the transaction. And so there's a chance that that will come, and it will be at the option of the seller. So one deal will be done exactly the way it's done now. Another one will be done as open offer. And how that'll happen, it seems, is that the seller can make up his mind, not necessarily at the time he takes the listing, halfway through the presentation if he wants, whenever. We aren't told exactly about that, but there is the potential that if a buyer says, hey, wait a minute, I don't want my offer to be shopped, he can put a clause in there saying, in the event that the seller elects to make open offers, I rescind this offer and it will become null and void. So that's it. And then we get into phase 3. Just very, very quickly, what are they going to do with phase 3? Well, what are they contemplating? They're contemplating specialty certification, and they've kicked that around before. And RICO's taking the position you can't call yourself a specialist, and they've reneged on that a little bit. You're going to see them cranking down on that. You're going to see them also possibly introduce a cooling off period. 1 or 2 provinces in the country now have it. After the deal becomes firm and binding, the buyer has 4 days to walk away. And of course, AREA is lobbying hard against that, and it's not etched in stone, but it's something that they're looking at. And then they're going to beef up continuing education. So we're going to see some changes. Some of the changes have already happened. Some of the changes are imminent. I think they're supposed to come out April the 1st. I don't think they'll be enacted right at April the 1st because the documentation is there. AREA is working hard at developing the forms. The government is going to have to, together with RICO, come up with this general information form and the form that a self-represented individual signs off on. A lot of these forms are going to have to change, and we'll keep you abreast of that as time goes on. I want to thank you very much for investing your time in watching this video. I hope it makes sense. I hope it's helpful. I'll talk to you again next week.